Welcome to our podcast, The Reappropriation of Space and Identity. I am one of your three co-hosts. My name is Andrew Wager. I'm majoring in business management at Cal State Fullerton, and I am from Liso Viejo in South Orange County, and these are my other hosts.
Hi, my name is Romeo Ortega. I am a sociology major with a minor in public administration and a concentration in social inequality, and I currently attend Cal State Fullerton.
Hi, my name is Andy Vera. I am majoring in computer science at Cal State Fullerton, and I am from South Central Los Angeles.
All right, well, perfect. So these are my co-hosts, and like I said earlier, our title is The Reappropriation of Space and Identity. So what does that mean? Well, these ideas are interlinked with the idea of spatial entitlement. This goes hand in hand with spatial identity. Spatial entitlement is, in essence, the ability to call a place, either physical or not, your own, and how these relate to people of color, specifically the Hispanic communities in South Central LA and Orange County, Greater Orange County area. And we will explore these ideas further into our podcast. And I will now pass this to my host, Romeo, for his next segment.
Hello, my name is Romeo Ortega, and I will be covering segment 1 on what is spatial entitlement. I will be answering and breaking down what's ahead of the podcast. First, I will be introducing the premise of the podcast on the topic of spatial entitlement. I'll be describing what is spatial entitlement, how spatial entitlement can be viewed by perspectives that are determined by one's motive and background, and the different forms that spatial entitlement takes shape in. This will help us understand the lived experiences of both Black and Brown communities and how they continue to survive amidst ongoing and continual forms of structural, individual, societal oppression. These communities persisted nevertheless through coming together to imagine, design, and articulate claims to space, place, and identity, through repurposing their limited and few spaces to their entitlement to be visible and survive. By showing how these communities came together to claim this limited space amidst ongoing oppression, we can reconceptualize and re-envision the way we connect the relationship of space and racialized identity for the better, and to gain a perspective that assists in understanding how communities take shape. Spatial entitlement. In first glance to the word spatial entitlement, we can assume through context clues that this means one's entitlement to space, though this word encapsulates a lot more than the claim to space. In the words of Gay Teresa Johnson's interview, Left of the Black, they define spatial entitlement as one's right to be seen in a space, in a landscape, and in a terrain. Alongside this definition, Gay Teresa Johnson goes on to define it as an alternative route that oppressed Black and Brown folks create because of their exclusion of equal rights in leisure spaces. In these spaces, they practiced their cultural customs, found visionary future outlooks, and created a congregated understanding of democratic politics. To further expand this description, we can supplement this by thinking of it as communities reinstating one's right to humanity, taking up physical space in a terrain that's been contested through devaluing their presence, show opposition in face of oppression, regain dignity, and represent activism in face of hate. Spatial identity is the result of the reappropriation and resignification on space. This allowed for community building, minority unity, and sites of connection and history. With the idea of spatial entitlement being the one's dignified, humanistic right to space, there is an additional double-edged nature of this claim to space. Depending on one's motive or perspective to approaching spatial entitlement, it can be seen in two forms of light. First, and the primary way we are looking at this, is from how communities of color were able to claim space of their own in the limited resource and opportunities they were given or left with. Second, we can also see spatial entitlement as the historical perception on who has overtaken land that wasn't theirs. Examples of this can be seen in gentrification, eminent domain, colonization, and predominantly white discourse that fills our consumption. A well understood yet rarely condemned event presented by the reading Spatial Entitlement, Race Displacement, and Sonic Reclamation in Post-War Los Angeles by Johnson presents this opposite form of spatial entitlement by showing how the Dodger Stadium was built over the destruction and forced eradication of Chavez Ravine, which contained primarily ethnic community. This land was occupied by a minority community, yet the city displaced them because of their own motive of entitled space. As stated in the same reading, the city built freeways that replaced streetcar local transportation, suburbs that provided perceptions of order and safety away from the dangerous minorities, quote unquote, and entertained a fantasy of a racialized region that was a southwestern outpost of white supremacy, quote unquote. Through all this exclusion and racialization of the minority because of the white entitlement of space, we follow the minority's reappropriation of space and identity to combat this form of spatial exclusion. The rest of the segments following are going to show the multiple forms that spatial entitlement takes shape in, such as sonic spaces that are created by music formation, where communities come together through sonic airwaves, understandings of particular places that inform on a people and place narrative to exemplify the connections to space, place, and identity, and the upcoming second segment that is the most commonly thought and visualized form of spatial entitlement, physical space. Hello, my name is Romeo Ortega, and I'll be continuing with segment 2 on physical space. What is physical space? In a journey to the reappropriation of space and identity for Black and Brown communities and minorities, the entitlement to space, in a sense, is a culture and climate of the politics of dignity arising from continual denial to live our greater society. Again, to reiterate the importance of spatial entitlement in regards to the physical space, it is important as these spaces are created because of their exclusion of equal rights in leisure spaces. Physical space appropriation is an easily recognizable form of spatial entitlement, as it is visually recognizable, yet its impacts, influence, and lasting efforts are easily overlooked, with terms such as undesirable, ghetto, dangerous, criminal, and up to no good. Examples of this physical space uptaking can be seen in the history of the Dolphins of Hollywood, a record store that was uptaken and created because of the minority community's exclusion to record stores, recording studios, and the technology that was associated with it. This record store, in a sense, transcended a space that was exclusive to the physical glamour of Hollywood into the discursive space located right on Central and Vernon. Through Dolphin's efforts, he exposed the community to technology, creative making, and business that was not typical to this space of South Central. My co-host Andy is going to go more in depth about the record store, as it holds great value onto this topic of spatial entitlement, sonic spaces, and the formulation to the reappropriation of space and identity. Another example could be understood through Rosas' Uncovering Black and Latino Relations, which depicts the unity amongst Black and Brown communities within the space of South Central. Many minority communities migrated and immigrated to South Central due to segregative policies and historical practices. With South Central comprised of mostly African American and Latinx communities, they united through common struggles and lived in unity. In this unity, they created ways to allow the two communities to traverse South Central by developing multilingual signs to enjoy the basic communicative rights that, in a sense, was a resistance to segregational practices they faced on the daily. These communal efforts of unity were also depicted by visual murals that took visual space that signified their existence in the space of South Central while preserving symbolic social unity. This history of reformulating a space caused by oppression allows us to reimagine these spaces from the common narrative of dangerous, unsafe, and inhumane to a community reinstating one's right to humanity, taking up physical space in terrain where their presence is devalued, regain dignity, represent activism in face of hate, and show how location, space, and the appropriation of it is what formulates their racialized identity. It's what their experiences were and how it shaped them and the space around them. This is culture derived from oppression. Culture forms through scarcity of space and exclusion. Though this racial unity was only for a period of time before more segregated practices took place, and this moment of time is now known as post-interracial unity of South Central. As depicted in the documentary LA92, the continual degradation to the physical and mental bodies of Black and brown people, it pushes them to the only remaining avenue to claim space. This is represented in the scene where on Florence and Normandy, they had enough not being allowed the right to live, even in their own space that they were left with. The space they made the best amongst continual resistance. With such heaviness of factors that do not let them live, they took part in another form of spatial entitlement in regards to physical space, occupying the intersection and in targeting majority whites while exclaiming not to attack the Mexicans. This is representing the unity that they're trying to uphold. They had even less avenues to their right to live, so they took it by a way they were driven to. This is a result of generational exclusion to space, identity, and life. Like Gay Teresa Johnson put it, even if we are not entitled anymore through public policy or legal means, we will regain our dignity in some mode through space. So when cops over-patrol their space that is quite often limited, scarce, underserved, ill-funded, and degraded physically and socially, on top of that, outsider cops and policing that brutalizes and criminalizes at a scale that is incomprehensible to outsiders not living in the same experience, there will be reclamation of space to claim their humanly right to dignity by any means possible. This racialization is a self-fulfilling prophecy in which minority communities are perceived by outsiders as dangerous when in reality, they're just trying to live as much as everybody else. This was their activism, their direct and blunt activism. And on top of that, physical spaces then served as a single form of spatial entitlement. And another form that entitlement manifests in is sonic spaces. This is what my co-host Andy will be covering next.
So, I will be talking about sonic spaces. To reiterate, sonic spaces stem from spatial entitlement due to creating a physical space where people get together with the use of music. Sonic spaces were being created because spaces were being taken away by society. As said in Johnson's reading, Spatial Entitlement, Race, Displacement, and Sonic Reclamation in Post-War Los Angeles, as post-war urban renewal policies enacted devastating losses of residential and social spaces. Youth from aggravated communities expressed their claims to meaningful space in the ways that were available to them, particularly through the production and consumption of popular music. So, as their spaces were being taken away, to be able to compensate with this, they created these sonic spaces. An example of this can be seen with John Dolphins of Hollywood record shop located in South Central LA. It was a record shop that was open to give people a feeling of how the real Hollywood was, thus its name, Dolphins of Hollywood. As stated in the interview, Left or Black with Gay Teresa Johnson, we live in a society where people of color cannot call any space their own and know whether they are not welcomed. So, a space that they were not welcome to was Hollywood, and this was due to, at the time, segregation was practiced. Aside from the record shop giving this feeling of places that were out of their reach, the record shop also created many other benefits for communities of color, such as giving many Black artists an opportunity to be able to make music. But as well, and most importantly, it helped reimagine the relationship between space and racialized identities. Due to its popularity as a sonic space, it gained so many attention from many different people around LA County. As described in Johnson's reading, the studio and the DJ summoned listeners around Central Avenue from the East Side and Chicano and Jewish neighborhoods, from newly constructed suburbs, and from communities in San Gabriel and Pomona valleys. While listeners from San Fernando Valley would travel 35 miles to buy R&B records at Dolphins. So the record shop created this interracial space between many of these different ethnic communities, all due to music. The record shop was like a catalyst to reimagine the relationships between spaces and identity because it caused so many people to come to South Central, and which was a black community, and realize it wasn't as the media and city officials depicted as. It was always portrayed as a dangerous and a war zone like area. Many city officials tried to keep this depiction by blockading the record shop and turning its white customers away and stating that it was too dangerous for them to hang around black neighborhoods. It was inevitable for the population to realize this. How the city and its people were depicted had changed from being dangerous to being a culture rich space with culture rich people, all thanks to this record shop. The legacy and the effect the record shop had on its people is still present today, despite the record shop not being there anymore. The sonic space created by Dolphins of Hollywood is, is present today in the form of Jazz Festival. The Jazz Festival is an event hosted yearly from Central and Vernon, the original location where Dolphins of Hollywood record shop was, to a couple streets northbound on Central Avenue. It was an event to appreciate jazz music and also the culture of the people who reside in South Central. Besides, besides for music, it also showed paintings, art, food, and so much more related to that culture. Based on my experience of attending one, I can say that it's just as how the record shop was described. It it had the same effect as Dolphins of Hollywood record shop. It brought so many people from so many different ethnic backgrounds together to appreciate the culture and people who reside in there. South Central Los Angeles wasn't the only area to experience a type of spatial entitlement by the Latinx and Chicanx community. Another location that went through similar experiences was a different with a different method was in Orange County.
All right, like my co-host Andy was talking about previously, we're going to talk about what is spatial entitlement. So I would define spatial entitlement is a race or ethnic group's entitlement to a physical or social space, with it having the ability to call it yours. So that brings us to the Yost Theater. The Yost Theater was owned and operated by the Olivos family in Santa Ana. This was the most prominent place of spatial entitlement for the large Latino population that lives in Santa Ana in Orange County. And from the reading from Gonzalez, during its early years, the US was considered Orange County's finest playhouse. It was a movie theater, but it was a movie theater owned by Mexicans, headlined by Mexicans, and catering to Mexicans. The Yost Theater represented a place of congregation and community to the large Mexican community that still inhabits Santa Ana to this day. And it challenged the idea that Orange County is this ethno-racially white, affluent, and politically conservative community that would have so quickly shunned this Latino community. The Yost in and of itself was not a place of discrimination. Unfortunately, after 30 years of owning and operating the Yost, the Olivos family was forced to sell their beloved theater to the city of Santa Ana in April of 1985. They had battled with the Downtown Regency Development Agency for 4 years, and after running out of money, the Olivos family was forced to sell. The city said that they would give the Olivos family the ability to buy back the Yost later, but this turned out to be a lie, and they were not presented with the opportunity. And the Yost became this gentrified space created to cater to the large white community that inhabits the greater OC area. And it took away the most prominent place of spatial entitlement for the Latino community in Santa Ana. So, why is this important? Because spatial entitlement is important for every group of people, but even more so for people of color and minority communities. Because at the whim of a largely white majority, their spaces and places of entitlement can be taken away, gentrified, and made into these half-baked gimmicks that are meant to appease the majority white communities. This is why we should fight for spatial entitlement for all.
After all of this, why are spatial spaces and spatial entitlement important? It is important to consider these two because they go on to shape the lives of many communities of color, such as the Chicanx and Latinx community. In a way, it helps explain how the identities came to be as we know them today and the spaces they reside in. The three examples mentioned, such as Dolphins of Hollywood Record Shop, the Yale Theater, and the neighborhoods of South Central LA, were just three instances of many that occurred in South LA and Orange County. Many of the issues during that time, such as segregation and racism, caused these spatial spaces to be created through spatial entitlement. It can also be seen as a form of resistance to many systems of racism that existed. It made a statement by the Chicanx and Latinx community about how they're making their presence known to society, how they're not going to let themselves be victims of these systems of racism, and they're going to dismantle them. They are people like everyone else, and their culture is dangerous as they're depicted, and the spaces they reside in are their own. They also spread a message of unity and solidarity among every community and change these assumptions made about the people and the spaces they reside in. As we approach the end, do any of my fellow co-hosts have any last thoughts?
Yeah, this is Romeo speaking, and I just have the last thought on spatial entitlement and how it trips me out on how common this is in our daily lives. My girlfriend and I have been traveling and hiking more often recently, and it's understood that this activity, this hobby of hiking and traveling and all this stuff that requires resource, right, money, whatever equipment, is predominantly white filled, and when our recent hike in Santa Paula, it was evident on the heavier presence of like the white majority of fulfilling these trails. And on the way back, near the beginning of the trail, we saw it more so where either you need the less resources and equipment to get through the trail. Brown families, minority families, Chicanx, Latinx communities, and they were on the same trail. But yeah, you could almost see the contrast in resource and equipment, as the white people had mainly all the resource that looked like it was going to assist them, and these brown families were in nothing but sneakers, JanSport backpacks, and jeans. It was pretty hot out. It's a dirt trail. You have to cross river like creeks and climb a waterfall thing, but it occurred to me that this is their sense of entitlement. This is their sense of entitlement to this space that is predominantly and arguably once taken from them. So I found it interesting that they were there to state their entitlement to this similar space, and they were trying to traverse the same environment despite the less resources.
Very well. This has been the end of the podcast, Reappropriation of Space and Identity. These were your hosts, Andy Vera,
Romeo Ortega.
And Andrew Wager.
and we hope y'all enjoyed it and have a wonderful day.